Hello everybody, this is going to be the second video for the lecture on human-nature relationships, and we're going to start by talking about the interspecies model of prejudice, and then we'll kind of extend this into a talk on animal rights. The interspecies model of prejudice is one that's formulated by a number of different studies conducted by Kimberly Costello and Gordon Hodson. And it's really concerned with the nature of how people understand the human-animal divide, or the extent that people believe that humans and animals are different and that humans are above animals. And what they've argued is that to the extent that people believe that animals and humans are different and humans are better than animals, the more likely they're going to be prejudiced against certain groups. And this will actually manifest in a dehumanization of those groups and viewing them more closer to animals than one's own in-group. So the basic kind of model is going to look like this sort of pathway I have here, where you have the human-animal divide. That's going to predict outgroup dehumanization, which in turn will of course lead to some sort of anti-outgroup bias, such as various types of discrimination. So in a sense, what this is doing is this is kind of playing off on some of the infrahumanization theory, but really diving much more deeper into just, I would say, the more simplistic understanding that infrahumanization theory provides. So remember, infrahumanization theory argues that we view our group as possessing more of the human essence than other groups, leaving those groups as less human. And we see this through the attribution of fewer uniquely human characteristics to those groups than we do to our own group. So this difference in humanist attribution between the in-group and the out-group from an interspecies model of prejudice perspective is due to the belief in a human-animal divide. And for the interspecies model of prejudice, this is going to explain some of the things that we see with dehumanization, that first we tend to view the outgroup as being more animalistic than our own in-group, and therefore because they're more animalistic, we're going to view ourselves as better, superior, basically how humans generally view themselves in relation to animals, as seen in North American culture today. And because there is more of an association between the outgroup and animals than we have with our own in-group, we tend to view them as being lesser and more able to exploit, manipulate, or basically use as some sort of means to some sort of end. Or we may view them as a threat and try to deal with it as we would deal with a threatening animal. So here we see beliefs that a culture may have, such as one in the human-animal divide that is actually pretty prevalent across a lot of different cultures in the world, could actually lead to intergroup conflict. Now, Costello and Hodson, who developed this pretty recently, like within the last 10 years, actually compared it to some other models of dehumanization and prejudice and found that the interspecies model of prejudice was the most predictive. And they were interested in, it's like, okay, if this is so predictive, is this something that people are aware of, that they understand? Like, how do people understand the nature of the human-animal divide with things such as dehumanization and prejudice? And what they had participants do was rate the degree that they thought various types of causes would actually lead to dehumanization and ethnic prejudice. So they had things such as just being closed-minded, being ignorant, media portrayal, symbolic threats, so threats to one's own culture from an outside group, general fear of an outgroup, organized religion, realistic threats such as war, social identity, and all of these things scored much higher than we actually see with the belief in human-animal divide. The belief in human-animal divide was actually the least rated potential cause or perceived cause for dehumanization and ethnic prejudice, from the participants, despite it being an actually strong predictor of prejudice and dehumanization. So to sum it up in other words, there's basically a difference between how people understand what causes prejudice and dehumanization from what's actually causing it. They don't view the belief in a human-animal divide as contributing in any real meaningful way, whereas actually being a pretty significant contribution to both dehumanization and prejudice. And this is perfectly understandable, I think. I don't think a lot of people think of the nature of, human-animal relationships as influencing kind of their perceptions of other people. However, if you actually look at the research in all these different areas that we've already talked about, you can actually see that this would actually make quite a bit of sense. So for example, I already brought up infrahumanization theory, how we tend to view other groups as being less than fully human. We tend to associate them a bit more with more animalistic associations than we do with our own group. In this conjunction with the tendency that we just see our group as better and more valuable than other groups is also significant. But we can also understand it in the context of terror management theory, where our cultures help us understand what does it mean to be human, whether it's based in religion, science, philosophy, what have you, and that those who don't meet our kind of criteria tend to be outside of our culture conflict with that. But from a TMT perspective, more importantly, they also serve as a reminder of our death because they call into question our death-denying constructs of a cultural worldview, which then also undermines the other one of self-esteem. And then there is the tendency for us to try to deny our creatureliness, our animal nature, so we need to distance from it. So here we can see basically the groundwork being laid out that we do have this tendency to view animals as threatening to humanity in some sort of way, that if we are animals, we are going to die, that we try to distance ourselves from that we associate outgroups more with animals, and this is going to lay the foundation for a belief in a human-animal divide, which is going to lead to prejudice and discrimination. But how can you actually study this idea? Well, I'm actually going to review a few studies that actually looked at this idea of the human-animal divide driving prejudice and discrimination. And I'm actually going to include one that suggests that this is also something that's going on with children and how the parents' own personality and worldviews may affect their children's tendencies towards dehumanization of other groups. So in a paper published in 2010 from Kimberly Costello and Gordon Hodson, they used a series of Canadian samples to address that question of whether or not the nature of the human-animal divide would influence outgroup dehumanization and prejudice. So in their first study, they conducted a correlational study with a Canadian sample, and they had the following measures. The first was immigrant dehumanization, or humanness, I guess would be a little bit more accurate way to put it, and this was measured through the attribution of different uniquely human traits and emotions, rating how much each trait or emotion applies to an immigrant group. They also measured animal-human similarity. This is essentially the opposite of the human-animal divide, and they measured this through a 10-item survey that had items such as humans are not the only creatures who have thoughts, some non-human animals can think too. And they would rate this on like a scale from 1 to 5, disagree strongly to agree strongly. To measure immigrant prejudice, they used a modern racism scale that had items such as immigrants are getting too demanding in their push for equal rights. And they also measured two different ideological perspectives, social dominance orientation, or SDO, and universalism. So social dominance orientation is characterized by the belief that there are differences between groups and some groups should rule and dominate over other groups. So this is characterized by the question in a survey such as superior groups should dominate inferior groups. So it's very explicit, very in your face, and they rate that from like a 1 to 7. Now universalism is basically the opposite, as viewing that humanity and these groups are all the same. There's really no difference between us. So one of the items in here would be, at one level of thinking, we're all of a kind. So again, the idea of all of a kind is kind of erasing the differences that we try to create between ourselves that inevitably lead to believing that one is better than the other. Now I'm going to talk about the results in two different ways. One is going to be the more simplistic, and then the other is going to be a bit more complex. So at the simplistic level, they actually found support for their model in that the more people thought that animals and humans were similar, the more likely they were to view immigrants as human by, attributing them higher levels of uniquely human characteristics and traits, and they were also less prejudiced against immigrant groups. The more complex, though really only slightly so, is that higher levels of social dominance orientation actually predicted lower levels of animal-human similarity, and this in fact led to more dehumanization and prejudice against immigrants. Whereas higher levels of universalism predicted more animal-human similarity, leading to humanizing immigrants and lower prejudice. So the significant association between group distinctions and human-animal distinctions can actually have a profound impact on both dehumanization and prejudice of outgroups, especially in this case with immigrants as studied by Costello and Hodson. Now this is a correlational study, so that means we can't really draw any causal paths. There might be third variables, there might be a number of other issues present, and this will threaten internal validity. So what Costello and Hodson did after this was actually conduct an experiment testing their hypotheses. So in their second study in this article, they actually manipulated the animal-human similarity according to two different factors. One is the similarities versus difference, and then the framing. Animals contrast to humans, and then humans contrasted to animals. So what this is going to look like, the 4 different cells that you would get, is that animals are human-like or humans are animal-like. That animals are inferior or humans are superior. Now, it looks like I'm just kind of switching things, but these mean the same thing. But actually, these are conceptually different. And they actually make different predictions based on kind of the nature of what these framings are going to suggest. So, for example, saying that animals are human like at a cognitive level brings animals to the levels of humans. So it kind of lifts them up. Therefore, they think if they frame editorial in the context that animals are human like, is going to actually reduce prejudice and dehumanization against outgroups because animals are being lifted up. Now, conversely, humans are animal like is actually taking humans down to an animal level at a cognitive perspective. And they actually cite some terror management research citing that this should be threatening to the individual because this is essentially lowering, quote unquote, humans to the quote unquote inferior level of non-human animals. And because of this, what they're going to argue is that because one's own humanity and their group's humanity is threatened, it's going to motivate them to dehumanize and be prejudiced against other outgroups. So as a terror management theorist, I'm just going to be biased and just outright say it. I think this is really playing into terror management theory and our kind of, disdain for our creatureliness when we're under existential threat. So right there, I just provided two different ways to frame animal-human similarities. Animals are human-like, which brings animals up, thus leading to lower levels of prejudice and dehumanization, versus human to animal, which says that humans are animal-like, and this is predicted to lead into more prejudice and dehumanization of immigrants. Now, the other two cells or two other editorials are going to focus on this idea of animal-human differences. So animals are inferior or humans are superior. And what this is going to do, again, is kind of elicit this human-animal divide and thus lead to higher levels of prejudice and dehumanization against immigrants. So they took articles that were actually used in a terror management study from Jamie Goldenberg and colleagues from 2001, and they just kind of adjusted a little bit to fit their needs, but basically it was the same idea. So that was the manipulated variable in this experiment, but then they measured a number of different other variables, and one was this idea of recategorization, or to what extent that the Canadian participants would recategorize the identity of the immigrants from their, country of origin to being Canadian. So a couple sample items on this measure would be like, I don't think of people in terms of being immigrants or non-immigrants, only as people who are part of one group, as in Canadian residents. As well as, the distinction between immigrants and non-immigrants is artificial. We are all part of a shared group, Canadian residents. There's also a measure of empathy, so this was from a 6-item empathy scale on which participants rated being sympathetic, compassionate, soft-hearted, warm, tender, and moved by immigrants. And then they also measured universalism, social dominance orientation, prejudice, and dehumanization the same way they did in the previous study that I talked about. And what they found was what we would expect based on what I talked about already, that the human to animal similarity condition and the two difference conditions increase dehumanization and prejudice against immigrants. However, when the editorial was framed from an animal to human similarity perspective, so kind of lifting up animals to human level, well, this actually increased the perceptions of immigrant humanness as rated by the participants, as well as reduced prejudice. But what it also did is it actually increased the recategorization of immigrants to being Canadian residents. So there was less of a group distinction between immigrants and other Canadians, and instead kind of a shared idea of just, they're people that live in Canada. So here we actually have experimental evidence showing some sort of causation going on for the human-animal divide and prejudice and dehumanization of outgroups. So because everything else was similar for the participants, we can't attribute this really to anything else other than the conditions that they were assigned to. And the condition that was assigned to the animal to human similarity actually reported more inclusiveness and less prejudice and dehumanization against immigrants. So again, showing a causal mechanism that was underlying the correlational research in study 1, but also adding on to this that the animal to human similarity actually increased recategorization and kind of putting the immigrant groups under the Canadian resident umbrella. Now, however, we have to consider this idea that we're not always in this kind of experimental condition where we're being offered one framing versus another. So what might explain people's tendencies towards dehumanization and prejudice against outgroups based on this interspecies model of prejudice? Well, One of the more simple answers is basically the culture, but how is that culture transmitted usually? Well, initially at a young age, it starts through the parents socializing the child into kind of the cultural expectations that they're going to reside in. So Costello and Hodson actually looked at this in a subsequent study. So, to kind of study the effect of the parents' ideology and parenting styles on the children's tendency towards discrimination and racial prejudice, Costello and Hodson had parents come into the lab with their children and collected measures from both groups. Now, importantly for this study, the parents and the children were both white Canadian children and parents. And this is important because the two groups that were being used in the study to compare each other were white and black. Now, the children who were in the age range between 6 to 10 years of age, and this is important to understand because we can't necessarily have them complete surveys and scales as we would with adults. So there's going to be kind of a difference in methodology for the measures of children and parents for levels of prejudice and dehumanization as well as animal-human divide. But they were actually pretty ingenious in how they tried to get these measures from the children. And what they did is they would give a series of cards to the children that had the different traits on them that varied between uniquely human and not uniquely human. So for each trait and emotion, they actually gave them 2 cards at one time. And they were supposed to put the cards in one of 3 different boxes. Now, if they thought the trait or the emotion was relevant or applicable to a white child target, they were supposed to put one of the cards into the white child box. If they thought a trait was applicable to the black child target, well, they would put that trait or emotion card into the black child box. If they thought the emotion or trait wasn't relevant for either the black or white child target, well, they would put it in a third box that was marked with an X, saying that it was not really relevant for either one. Now, for each trait emotion, the child was given 2 different cards, so if they thought that both white and black children had this, well, they would put a card in each of the white and black boxes. So if the white and black child boxes had the same amount of human-related cards in there, well, they would be rated as equally human. However, if there was more in the white or black child box, that group would be viewed as more human than the other. So this is a way basically to measure infrahumanization using a child sample. To measure child's dehumanization of outgroups, they looked at animalistic outgroup representations by having children explicitly associate black children with animals using a 60 centimeter horizontal same difference board. So in this board, children placed a picture of a black child and animals closer together or farther apart, reflecting whether there was more similarity or difference between the groups. So if the child placed the 2 pictures close together, it reflected greater perceived similarity between black children and non-human animals, and thus a dehumanization of the outgroup. Whereas if they put the 2 pictures further apart, there was a greater difference and thus more of a separation between animals and black children. So I should mention at this point that this seems like very unethical for children to do. It could be very problematic in a number of different cases, but this is why it's very important to debrief participants, even children, in kind of explaining what the study was about, what they're studying, and providing some of that information for the children to go forward with. But it also allows us to study the socialization of various types of socio-political and socio-cultural attitudes and beliefs. Now, to measure the human-animal divide, they had the children do pretty much a similar measure to the dehumanization measure using that 60 centimeter horizontal same different board. But this time the pictures were for humans and animals. And if the humans and animals were closer together, well, that's more human-animal similarity. Whereas if they're further apart, well, that's more of a human-animal divide. Now, to measure prejudice, they actually used a very similar methodology that they used for studying dehumanization or measuring dehumanization and the different attribution of traits between a white and black child target by putting cards in different boxes. But these were split between positive adjectives, so smart, clean, and polite, and negative, bad, bossy, and dirty. And the distribution between the positive and negative between the black and white children in the boxes would determine the level of racial prejudice. Then they measure the cognitive ability of the child by having them do the water conservation task, and this is basically when you have a very tall but skinny beaker filled with water, and you dump it into a more shorter, fatter, or wider beaker, and you ask them which one had more water, the taller one or the shorter one. Now, if you've mastered the principles of conservation, what that means is they're going to say, well, it has the same amount because you just emptied one into the other. But for children, they're going to judge it based on some sort of criteria and view that there's actually more or less water in one of the other beakers. And for this, they coded as whether they mastered water conservation task or they didn't. And this is basically looking at cognitive development for the child, as you may have remember from Piaget in your 104-105 class. Now, for the parents, they actually measured social dominance orientation, belief in the human-animal divide, dehumanization, and racial prejudice in similar ways as they did in the previous studies I talked about. However, with the racial prejudice, instead of immigrants, they used black individuals as the target group. But they also looked at parenting styles in terms of how authoritarian the parents were to their children. So they had them complete a measure that, looked at this, and one of the sample items was, I scold and criticize to make my child improve. So what did they find? Well, one of the initial findings is that they were actually able to replicate the interspecies model of children process with children, in the sense that the more that children tended to engage in the human-animal divide, the more likely they were to dehumanize the black children, and thus leading to higher levels of prejudice. So not only is this important because they found that this model was able to replicate, but they were actually able to replicate it with children and not adults. But they also found something else that's very important, and that was the parents' level of social dominance orientation. Again, understood as the idea that there are differences between groups and some groups should dominate over other groups. Well, this actually predicted higher levels of human-animal divide for the children. And a couple other things to note is, again, they replicated the same interspecies model of prejudice with the parents as well. And for the children, they did find that the cognitive ability, so whether or not they were able to master the water conservation task, as well as authoritarian parenting styles, also predicted levels of dehumanization and prejudice. However, if you actually have the model of interspecies model of prejudice, whereas the belief in the human-animal divide leads to dehumanization, which leads to prejudice, they find that this is still significant and still fits when you are going to statistically control for the parenting styles in cognitive ability. So in other words, even considering the fact that some of these children did not pass the water conservation task, and even considering that some of their parents tend to be very authoritarian, we still see this significant path of, the interspecies model of prejudice. We don't see it being affected to the point where it becomes non-significant. So here, authoritarian parents and cognitive ability is not explaining the tendency towards dehumanization or prejudice. However, the parent's level of social dominance orientation is actually having an indirect effect on the child's tendencies towards dehumanization and prejudice. So one interpretation of this might be that it's not necessarily the parenting style or how the parent treats the child that's going to influence their perceptions of outgroups in terms of dehumanization and prejudice, but rather how the parent themselves understands and classifies groups as whether being different and then dominant versus inferior to each other. However, these analyses are correlational, so you have to keep that in mind. There could be other things going on. There might be a biological component. There might be a number of other things going on. So this study is largely correlational in that aspect, and that does need to be considered when you're looking at the kind of transmission, or the possible transmission, I should say, of these different types of beliefs and their impact on the child's beliefs and behavior. Now, what else is interesting is that the belief in human-animal similarity does not just end with how we treat other human beings, but also how we treat animals. Now, what we see from a number of studies is that the more human-like we view animals in terms of their various characteristics, traits, and abilities to feel emotions, we tend to afford those animals more rights than those that do not. I should also just take a quick moment to just explicitly state that this is not part of the interspecies model of prejudice, but the findings are pretty consistent with the overarching idea of what the human-animal divide means for how humans may relate to nature and other people. I should also mention that these studies tap more into this idea of anthropomorphism, this idea of attributing non-human entities human characteristics, but I want to put it here just because I think it's kind of a nice complement or juxtaposition to the interspecies model of prejudice. However, I'm also going to be talking about the nature of anthropomorphism and how that relates to human-nature relationships when I do talk about anthropomorphism, because I do want to talk about pet ownership and how that can actually be understood as well under this human-nature relationship. Now, basically, the assumption is that if we attribute a sense of humanness to animals, we should be less likely to eat them, or will be less likely to eat them, or use them for more aggressive or harmful means. Now, a correlational study that looked at this was by Bastian and colleagues in 2012. What they had participants do was just rate of 32 animals on the two different mind perception categories. So agency, so how much they were, able to willingly and intentionally do various types of things, as well as experience. So, being able to feel or experience kind of existence. So a couple of the items for the agency were things like, self-control, morality, and memory, whereas the experience related capacities were like hunger, fear, pleasure, pain, rage. And then they had them complete the measure of the edibility of the animal. So, like the likelihood that the animal could be eaten and should be eaten. And then also the morality of eating the animals that they were rating. Now, what they found is that the higher tendency to attribute them a mind, and this was an aggregate or an average of the experience and agency items, the lower edibility ratings they gave the animals, and viewed it as more immoral or less moral to eat those animals. So essentially, by attributing them as a mind capable of experience and agency, we view that eating those animals are just wrong and we're going to be less likely to do it. So those animals would be, things that are like pets, our dogs or our cats, we tend to view of having experience and agency. However, cows not so much. Now, for the second study, what they wanted to look at is if they described animals in terms of, are they going to be food or just in a more neutral context, will that influence whether or not we attribute them a sense of mind or not? So, what they did is they had participants read one of two different excerpts, and one just described cows or sheep very neutrally, just kind of describing their basic, concept of what is a cow or what is a sheep. However, the other condition describe them in a way that, about how they would be butchered and eventually packaged for meat products to be sold at stores. And then after that, they had them complete a scale that was, again, the agency and experience minds and the attribution of those to the cows or sheep. And what they found is that it didn't matter if it was a cow or a sheep, that didn't have any kind of predictive value. What actually did predict the mental capacity of the cow or sheep, though, was whether if it was framed more in control weight or food. And they found that if you describe an animal in terms of food to be butchered and packaged for meat, you're going to attribute it less mind. You're going to view it less capable of agency or experience. And they argue that's a way to kind of make you feel better about being able to eat the meat, because if you consider the animal as something that can suffer and does suffer if you kill it for food, you're going to be less likely to do that because we generally don't want people or animals even to suffer. So just like we do with humans when we need to make them suffer, apparently, and same thing we do with animals. We deny them a sense of mind that would actually experience that. So Bastian kind of talked about this and kind of this kind of weird position that humans tend to be. That a lot of humans love animals. We adore animals. We love to have them as pets, go see them at a zoo or an aquarium. We like to play with them. We find them just generally entertaining. However, we also love to eat meat. So how can we get out of this paradox? Well, we can view animals as separate, entities, which is good because each species is actually separate. But what that means is that for some species, such as dogs, we're going to say, hey, our dogs can feel, various types of experiences or have experiences. They're able to make decisions and have a sense of agency or guilt. But, a fish can't, a cow can't, deer can't, pigs can't. And that is a way for us to kind of differentiate between what we can eat or not. Now, of course, some of these animals can have a sense of experience and, even a sense of agency in many cases at a pretty complex level, such as pigs. But we don't allow ourselves to consider that when we're, let's say, eating bacon. We have to kind of stop that and say, like, okay, no, we cannot do that. Because if this thing has experience, if this thing has agency, I'm committing some horrible behavior. And we don't do that with other animals like dogs. In fact, and sometimes we tend to anthropomorphize or attribute our, dogs with even more agency or more experience than they may actually have. And that might be just to kind of help with a sense of loneliness that we might feel because of that tendency for us to engage in anthropomorphism to increase a sense of social connectedness. So again, not totally related to that interspecies model of prejudice, but we can see there that just by having these animals and kind of viewing them less human than what they generally are, by denying them agency and experience, it allows us to engage in even more harsher treatments against them, such as killing them for food. Now that is it for this video. In the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the idea of folk biology and how that can influence the human nature relationship. So I'll see you in a bit.